All right, for those who don't know, I'm actually the Vice President of the Native Orchid Society. The Vice President's a fairly symbolic role. You don't actually have to do much. So you're meant to stand in when the President's away or not working, but Gordon, he's always working and he's never away, so it's an easy gig for me. I'll introduce myself. I'm also the President of the Field Geology Club, and whenever I introduce the speaker of the evening, I put a little slide together, and because I gave a talk last year, I had to introduce myself once again. So I graduated from Flinders Uni, did a Bachelor of Science in Geology back in the early 80s. When I got out of uni, there was no jobs. The industry was a bit of a downturn. There were no jobs in geology, so I spent 5 years as a storeman, of all things, concentrating on my musical career. I was in many bands around Adelaide back in the day when there was a good music scene in Adelaide. Then I got married to my dear wife Neva, thought I'd better get serious in life, so I joined Geoservices. Geoservices is an oil field service company. It was French owned, they had about 5,000 employees. I worked as a logger, started out in the Cooper Basin. We contracted to Santos back in the day. Eventually I worked all around the world in various roles and capacities. We were taken over by one of the biggest service companies in the world, Schlumberger, the massive company. We went from being a small family-owned business of 5,000 employees to being part of a 140,000 employee company, so we just became a number. But I managed to last 5 years in Schlumberger. Ended up living in Paris, in Montmartre. My faithful dog Stendek went everywhere I did. Me and my wife lived there for 3 years. Then I moved to, my last hitch was in Baku, Azerbaijan. I was the operation manager for the logging segment of Schlumberger, and then the downturn came and I thought it's time to go. So I've been actually retired for almost 10 years now, but I've been really enjoying my retirement. I've been able to join all these groups. I've always been in the Malacological Society of South Australia, which deals with predominantly marine molluscs, and I'm the current president of that. Also, I work as a volunteer in the South Australian Museum in the Marine Invertebrates Department. So my talk tonight is on orchids, geology and evolution. Now, when I volunteered to give this talk, I actually, while I know a reasonable amount about geology and I can get by with evolution, I know nothing about the relationship between orchids, geology and evolution. So it's a good thing to volunteer to do a talk because you've got to go and then research and find out. So I have, and hopefully I can share what I learnt with you tonight and not bamboozle you too much, I hope. Ironically enough, on Sunday, the Field Geology Club went to Burrell National Park, and we do field trips, and this was just a day trip, and we looked at the geology. We went to Old Government House and had a tour through there, which I can recommend. And because we're there in springtime, I thought I'd also introduce everyone to orchids. So there was a good half a dozen flowering orchids. We ended up walking from Gate 9 down to the waterfall. Orchids everywhere, and a lot of our people in the club are also interested in natural history and birding. But I didn't know what club I was in there. At one stage, Leo turned up, and there was Greg from NOSSA and some other bloke looking at orchids at the same time. So yeah. But I'm still waiting to find one of these Tasmanian tigers that allegedly occur in Burrell National Park. I live very close by and I'm yet to find one, but apparently this young English lass saw one there a few years ago and it made global headlines. So looking at the photo, it's not very convincing. I think it's a mangy fox or someone's dog, but anyhow, it was a bit of a story there for a while and brought national attention to Burrell National Park. So when talking about evolution, we have to consider the geological timescale. So as we know, the world is very old, 4.5 billion years old, and of course land plants didn't come along till about 400,000 million years ago, after the Cambrian explosion, when fossils first started appearing in the fossil record. This is a schematic of how plants developed. I guess the main thing we're concerned with are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. They branched off from the gymnosperms, the pines that came before. And angiosperms are distinguished by producing a flower with seeds and fruit, and they evolved alongside insects as pollinators. So if we look at this chart here, angiosperms have been around since the Cretaceous. So the Cretaceous was also the time of the dinosaurs. They overlapped with the time of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs existed right through the Mesozoic, an immense amount of time they survived, and they were also around when orchids first evolved. So if we look at the big picture here, there are about 30,000 species of orchids globally. Most of them are in the tropics. Australia has 1,600 species, 90% of which are endemic to Australia, and they make up 15% of Australian threatened flora. So you can see there's two schematics here, the orchid family tree globally and the orchid family tree locally in Australia. There are 5 subfamilies, and you can see that the epidendroids, which are the ones that live in trees, epiphytes, 21,000 species. So they're but most of these occur in the tropics. If you look at Australia, down on the bottom right, they make up 270 species, whereas the orchids are 1,000 species. These are the terrestrial ones with the bulbs, so they're 1/3 of global subfamilies. So that's what we mainly focus on this evening. So Australian orchid distribution, not surprisingly, it's not many in the central desert dry areas. They very much rely on precipitation. So the hot spots are the southwest of Australia, down the east coast, and of course down in southwest Australia. So orchids do need good precipitation. So when I started my research, I thought, oh well, I'll go to the big book. I only just bought this last year, so I thought, all right, what's this going to tell me about orchids and their relationship to geology and evolution? Well, there is actually a few paragraphs on this topic, so it was a starting point. And it told me that orchids evolved originally around 80 to 120 million years ago. And this was based on a paper, if I looked up the reference, Givnish etc. al. 2016. So this edition was brought out 2024, so about 8 years prior this reference. The book also stated that orchids actually originated in Australia and then migrated to South America via Antarctica, because at the time all the continents were joined together in the supercontinent Gondwana land. So these are the two facts I had to start out with, but there wasn't much other information in general orchid books. I had to then start doing research on the internet and looking up specific papers. So one of the first ones I came across was this paper, which has basically had the hypothesis that terrestrial orchids, their speciation across Earth, has been driven by global cooling. And there's a whole raft of authors there. So the traditional approach in Darwin's time was that evolution was a linear process with time. And Darwin actually, after he wrote his book on Origin of the Species, his famous book on evolution, he then wrote a book on orchids, believe it or not. And I don't think it sold nearly as well, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 copies at the time, but obviously well sought after now, but he did beautifully illustrated, and he did study orchids and their relationship to pollinators and such a vast array of species. He couldn't really explain how they evolved so quickly and into these myriad of different morphologies. So it was a bit puzzling for Darwin, but he didn't shy away from a challenge. This particular paper, basically they go through herbariums and they pull out little tiny samples of orchids, and then they do the DNA analysis, which is what everyone's doing these days, and there's really good techniques. They're getting better and better and faster, and they can plot these rather complicated phylogenetic trees, which is basically showing the evolutionary relationship between the orchids, and this is showing it through time. So the scale on the bottom right, it goes basically from 50 million years, which is the central point of this arc, to the present time. So as these lines are going out, the different genre, you can see they're diversifying, and they diversify very rapidly the closer they get to the present day. So they use, basically they look at the mutation rate of orchids through time, and the more mutations one orchid species has with another means the more distantly related it is, and this is measurable. They can actually measure how much time that the two species have departed ways. They then came up with this graph, and this graph is showing time in millions of years, so 50 million years to present, basically the Eocene to the present. You can see that black line at the top is an average of global temperatures. They're actually using, and you can see generally since the Eocene, global temperatures have been going down. If you went back to the Eocene 50 million years ago, now remember this is after the age of dinosaurs, they went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, the world was a hothouse. It was generally 30 degrees Celsius from the poles to the equator, all over the world. It was an absolute hothouse. You had all these huge woolly mammoths and rhinoceroses and everything running around, and yeah, it would have been an amazing place. The red line down the bottom is the estimation of speciation rate, so how fast orchids have evolved. And you can see it was fairly flat, and then we get right near the end of around 5 million years ago, during the Pleistocene, shoots right up. So really rapid evolution, relatively recent in geological terms. So why is this? Well, the paper doesn't have an exact answer, but it says there's definitely a correlation. They did a lot of mathematical formulas to see if it was correlated to other things, and this is what they came up with. One of the theories is that in recent times there's been a series of ice ages, roughly every 120,000 years. So very cyclic. And this Russian guy, Milankovitch, came up with this theory that it's all to do with astronomical phenomenon involving the Earth wobbling around on its axis and how it goes around the sun and the changes in its orbit. And from this, we get the different ice age. We get an ice age, then we get an inter-ice age period, then another ice age. So apparently this is a possible explanation for the rapid increase in diversity, because orchids have had to cope all the time with these climate change relatively quickly. 120,000 years, it's not that long. So this is a plot showing the last 400,000 years, and you can see there's, you don't have to look too closely, but there's sort of like 3 peaks and 3 troughs. They represent sea level, carbon dioxide, and global average temperature. So basically, the polar regions have been freezing up during cold times. The global water, sea level, drops, and then when it warms up, the ice caps melt and the sea level goes up. So this has been happening on and off every 120,000 years, and it's resulted in perhaps rapid speciation of orchids. They then come up with this graph, and what this is showing is species richness at the top. So if you see anything in red or orange, that's showing areas of species richness. And you can see it's, and this is the orchoids, remember, this is the terrestrials, not the epiphytes. So you can see species richness is across Europe and into North America, and also South Africa and Australia. But if you look at the speciation rate, it doesn't follow that top curve. The speciation rate has been fastest in Australia, according to this chart, for terrestrial orchids. So that's an interesting result. Okay, so that was an interesting study. I went on to the next one I could find, and this was when orchids ruled the earth. And so this was a huge study. They took many, many samples of DNA, probably the biggest study on orchids done so far, big collaboration. So they used all 5 subfamilies of orchids, 17 of the 22 tribes, 40 of the subtribes, 285 genera, and 1,921 out of the almost 30,000 species. So most of these samples came from herbariums around the world, and it was a very large study looking at DNA of orchids to try and work out how they're related and when they evolved and how old. The results they came up with were at odds with the book that I'd previously talked about. So they had the following 3 hypotheses that they wanted to test. One of them was that an Australasian origin for the most recent common ancestor, which is what my book told me, and that Southeast Asia is the region with the highest current diversity. So that's what they were trying to test. Like I said, they did DNA sequencing of orchids from all around the world. So this map's showing the distribution range of orchids, and they truly are pretty well global, except for Antarctica and some of the desert areas. They used Kew Gardens, has a world checklist of vascular plants with locations, global locations, so they could pinpoint the locations. And then they came up after their, with their DNA studies with this rather complicated phylogenetic tree. So this is another way of representing the tree. It's got all these branches going out. And this is what they came up with, this tree and the relationship between the orchids. And they estimated the age of Orchidaceae, the family, to be basically 120 million years, so early Cretaceous. Most of them started evolving around 83 million years ago, and they put the ancestry coming out of Laurasia, not Australia. So where is Laurasia, you may say? And most orchid species originated 5 million years ago. So this is what my book was telling me, that orchids came out of Australia, migrated through Antarctica, Gondwana, up to Laurasia. And this is from the study from Givenish, etc. all in 2016. But this one, 8 years later, completely contradicted that. But they had a much wider sampling rate, and DNA has come a long way. And so what they found is the orchids actually evolved in Laurasia. This continent up the top is called Laurasia, which today is essentially North America. And it came down through Gondwana into South America and Asia and Australia and all these countries and across to Europe. So that was interesting. The study also concluded that the highest diversification rate of orchids was actually in Central America. Central and Southern America. So it has 4.5% of the world's flora and fauna and just 0.5% of the land surface, but it's got the highest species richness. And it also showed the global patterns of speciation, so it's different to the number of species, is also very high in South America. Not so high in Australia. Our speciation rate's quite low, actually, even though we're a hot spot for species. So that paper was interesting, so a bit confusing at first, but got there in the end. Evolutionary relationship and range of greenwood orchids. So these are pterostylus orchids we'll all be familiar with. They show quite diverse range of flower morphologies. Some of them trap the insects with the upturned labellum. Other ones have the downturned labellum with the floral stalk sort of resembling an insect. So they trick the insects to come in and pollinate them. Then there was this other paper on it's the second largest orchid subtribe in Australia with over 3,000 species, so they're all terrestrials. So we've got about 1,060 species, so about a third of the species in the world. And once again, they're confined to this, obviously, Southeast Australia, Eastern Australia, but also up in New Guinea and New Caledonia and across in New Zealand have some species as well. So basically this study was also using DNA, and it found the major origin of greenhoods was in the Oligocene, so around 30 million years ago. But the major diversification occurred once again in the Miocene, and then in the Pleistocene, the last 5 million years, they really started to take off. And there's some conjecture to why this is, but Australia broke away from Antarctica, started drifting northwards, and we went from lots of tropical forests, rainforests, to more arification and more grasslands, which perhaps favoured terrestrial orchids. So this is just a diagram representation. There's Australia. It used to be part of Gondwana. It was all hooked up with South Africa and New Zealand and everything. The whole lot broke apart, and Australia has been slowly drifting northwards at about 5 centimetres a year. So I guess in my lifetime I've got closer to Asia because it's been 5 centimetres. It soon adds up over the years. When it broke apart from initially, Australia and Antarctica broke away from the rest of Gondwana land, and India and South America all drifted off. But what the really important thing that happened, at one stage in the late Eocene, there was a huge gulf between Australia and Antarctica. But when Australia finally separated, and at this time South Africa and South America had separated, it opened up this huge circumpolar current, which had profound effect on the climate of the world. It really started to cool the climate down. This is truly one of the driving forces of the cooling of climate. And we can actually see this in the cliffs down at Maslin. You go from the Eocene through the Oligocene, Miocene. You can actually see the formation this happened in. The other interesting thing about what happened is we have the longest south-facing coastline in the world. You know, Africa and South America tend to be pointy. We got this long coastline, so I guess this would have affected orchid evolution. It certainly affected the marine invertebrates and fish of Australia because they're all quite endemic in the southern temperate zone. Now, the thing about this Milankovic cycles I was talking about earlier, we got a famous geologist who unfortunately no longer with us, Reg Sprigg. You might have known Reg, very famous. His son is still alive, runs the Arkaroola Ridgetop Tours. He was a geologist, discovered many things, the Ediacaran fauna, submarine canyons, Cooper Basin, uranium, mapped all of South Australian what he did. Started Beach Petroleum, which is still going today against the odds. And there's a couple of books he wrote, and I think his daughter-in-law wrote a book. And even if you're not interested in geology, they're great books. They're really good. I highly recommend them. But anyhow, he saw the relationship between these cycles and what's happening down in the southeast of South Australia, because as you drive through there, you can't help but notice these dunes you're driving across in the middle of the countryside, and you go, what are they doing here? You know, and these are actually ancient seabed levels. So going from east to west, they get younger. So these are at times when the sea level's been going up and down, and they match these cycles. So Reg was very smart to figure this out. This is before the internet. You couldn't just look these things up, but he put 2 and 2 together, and sure enough, yeah, it's widely accepted. So you've got all these sand dunes that you go across, and some good orchid territory down, as we know, down in the southeast, some unique orchids. And here's a plot of the sea level over the last 120,000 years. So this is just one cycle. That red line, it's wide because it's sort of measuring the minimum, maximum probability. But you can see we're currently in a present day warm period. So the sea level is relatively high, but you only have to go back 20,000 years, and the sea level is 120 metres lower. So you could basically, 20,000 years ago, we could all walk across to Ardrossan or down to Kangaroo Island, no problems. Yeah, amazing to think. But then, if you go back 120,000 years during the last interglacial maximum, the sea level was actually a couple of metres higher than it is today. And we can see that in the cliffs all around York Peninsula, and it's very obvious. There's all these shell beds that are much higher than the present day beach. So there's the modern day coastline with the continental shelf, and that would have all been exposed only 10,000 years ago. So the River Murray would have been running through, and this would have all been land. So just imagine there would have been much more land for orchids to occupy. So who knows what species were growing in these areas and what the environment was and what they evolved into, or did some even go extinct? Who knows? We'll never know. Orchids don't fossilise, as you probably appreciate. We do have some fossil plants in Australia, but not many. I mean, I can hardly think of any in South Australia. There's some in the North Maslin Sands Quarry down at Maslin Beach, but that's not available to the public. Up at Lee Creek, there's a few in the coal beds, but yeah, they're not very common plant fossils at all. Marine invertebrates are much more common because they've got hard parts, so they're all over the place. So if you go into some of these sand dunes, you can see all different structures showing ancient beach structures. Across at Port Julia, only last weekend or the weekend before, and I'd never walked north along the beach from Port Julia, and I found a raised seabed. So you got the Kunkar level, and there was all the shelly lavels, and I pulled out a couple of these. Now this is Anodonta trapezium, which is no longer found in South Australia, but 120,000 years ago they were around. Everything else 120,000 years ago, it's not long geologically, is still on our beach today. All the shells you pull out of the rocks, they could have just been washed up yesterday. But this one isn't around. This one did go extinct. It's still found in Sydney. They did try and re-establish it at one stage because it makes actually good eating, the blood cockle. We often get it in various Asian dishes, but they weren't successful. But it is starting to turn up in Inat in the Port River. I think it's being brought in the bilge, and it's living in the Port River. But anyhow, this was clear evidence of this raised seabed. Okay, so getting back to this study, once again it said most of these species were inferred to have originated in the Pleistocene. So you've got these rather complicated looking diagrams, but all they are is showing the evolutionary relationship through time, so the Miocene through to present, and they've colour-coded it for the different regions in Australia they think these orchids originated from. Basically, they're saying that most of Pterostylis or greenhoods originated in eastern Australia and then migrated across to Western Australia. And I think it was seed dispersal, correct me if I'm wrong, but that got them to New Zealand. I think I heard that at another talk somewhere. Orchid seeds are just like dust, very, very fine. In fact, a mate of mine, Peter Hunt, who gave a talk here a few years ago on land snails, he was working in the herbarium for 3 years. There was a grant given to them to take photographs of seeds. So he sat there all day with his Olympus stacking microscope and took photographs of seeds, and they're all on the internet available. But the orchid seed's extremely tiny, very hard to photograph. And he was using software on the camera that would stack literally 30 photographs all together, so you got good resolution. Another study here, orchid diversity through space and time. Once again, it's just showing the species richness for Australia. Not surprisingly, same place. So they've plotted all the species. Once again, it's just supporting what I talked about before. And they looked at the global, if you look at the global biodiversity of vascular plants, not surprisingly, they're in the tropical areas. Now, this is a trend for just about all life on Earth as you go to the equator. Doesn't matter if you're looking at insects or lizards or whatever, there's more species richness. So it's a bit unusual that for Australia, our species richness is down in the more temperate zone. It doesn't increase as you go up to the tropics. It's a bit of a reverse. So orchid distribution and rarity is also not only influenced by the evolutionary past, but also by the pollinator relationship is very important. It evolves along with insects, and the mycorrhizal fungi for nutrients, which in turn depends on the soil and the moisture and the pH. And of course, soil depends on the bedrock, so this is where we get to geology. So once again, I couldn't find a lot on the internet about the relationship between orchids and geology, but they are found in all geological areas, but some are more common than others. Just a very quick lesson, you'll remember from school, there's 3 main classes of rocks: igneous, metamorphic and sedimentary. So your igneous rocks are like your granites. Sedimentary are things like sandstone, siltstones. And your metamorphic are rocks that have been buried subject to pressure and turn into schist or marble or so forth. So, of course, all these rocks can break down and they determine the structure of the soil. So the bedrock, or what's underneath the soil or nearby in the mountains, will determine the soil structure, and in turn will determine a lot of orchid distribution. Although there doesn't seem to have been any real research into correlating orchids in Australia to the type of soil or bedrock. There is general information out, but I did come across this study, but it wasn't too helpful because it's Serbia. He did do a survey and tried to match the orchids to the different rock type. Limestone dolomite was one of the more prevalent type of areas where orchids are found, which is similar in Australia actually. A lot of our orchids are found in that type of environment. And I had to look up that term underneath, opolyptic melange, which means a jumble of igneous and sedimentary rocks. So that was a new one to me. So if we look in June's book, this can be quite helpful. If you look under habitat, it'll often say the soil type that the orchid is found in. So that will give you an idea of the geological area, but not always, but a lot of them do. So I was flicking through it trying to find trends, but I might spend some more time doing that, because it does seem that certain groups favour certain types of soil. There are very good publications and websites on the soil of South Australia. I've got a couple of books at home, quite thick books, beautifully illustrated with all the soils, lovely maps showing the main soil types. So most of the soils running up through from Flinders Ranges and Mount Lofty Ranges down to Kangaroo Island, these are all the more hilly type clayey soils, but when we get out either side of this major range, they tend to go into the calcareous sandy soils. We're a fairly ancient continent. Our soil isn't particularly fertile. The farmers have got to pump in the superphosphates and fertilisers, as we know, particularly on York Peninsula. So there are 15 main soil types in South Australia. 2 of the more important ones are the calcareous soils and the shallow sandy soils. And I've seen many of our orchids growing in these areas. The soil determines, you can look at the grain size and the texture and how much clay's in there. So we'll focus on Yorke Peninsula because this is an interesting area. There are still remnant patches of conservation park. We've got the big one, Innes, down the bottom, and then Levens in the middle, and a few little Minlacowie and little tiny conservation parks and a few private properties that have orchids. But this entire area is underlain by big blocks of very hard carbonate. And you can see here down at Wattle Bay, where the turbines are, you can see all these blocks have eroded out onto the beach as the sand dunes are eroded back. So this layer goes right across underneath through Yorke Peninsula. Here it is at Port Julia. So it's a calcrete, a very hard sort of calcium carbonate deposit. And the local name is Kunkar. I don't know where that originated, but it's quite a nice sounding name, the Kunkar. So here you can see a nodular layer. Often it is nodular in shape. Here's another picture at Port Julia. This is all Kunkar, a massive layer, and then up the top you've got a completely different type of nodular layer. And a lot of this was when the seafloor was exposed and wind-blown sand and calcrete was being blown onto the land and it accumulated. And some of it's from the evaporation in the Mediterranean climate, hot summers and wet winters, and the water tables going up and down, concentrating the calcium carbonate, particularly from the limestone underneath, into nodules. You can see these beautifully preserved nodules in cross-section sitting there. And this is quite a common, I've seen this at Mannum as well. You can find nodular layers. There's a granite quarry on the other side of the river from Mannum. And if you go there on one side, beautiful nodular layers. This is a Cable Bay campground at Innes National Park. You see all different layers of Kunkar. It's all different types. Some are rubbly, some are softer and more eroded. And there's the raised beach shell layer down the bottom with shell fragments. And you've got this one here, another one at Innes National Park. The big cliffs there, you've got a very thin layer of calcrete at the top, but most of the rest of it is wind-blown sand. So it's made up of sand that is consolidated. So the orchids have to cope with this environment. And underlying often the calcrete layer is the very old Miocene layer of when the whole area was under the ocean. This is packed full of marine fossils. So the calcrete layer, relatively recent, and then we got the old Miocene limestone, full of shell fossils, echinoderms, fossil shark teeth, more recent sediments, and the Kunkar at the top. So this is what the farmers have got to cope with. They got all this Kunkar all over their properties originally. They all had to bulldoze it or whatever they did, manhandle it, build fences out of it, build dwellings, but it's everywhere. You can't help but notice it when you go to Yorke Peninsula. And here's little orchids growing up, their leaves popping up through the rubbly Kunkar layers. Obviously evolved to cope with it. We can see this is down at Innes National Park. Now this mossy soil is growing right on top of this great flat sheet of Kunkar. You can see it in the corner there. It was only a very sort of thin layer, and here it is popping up. And often you get this sort of more rubbly soil structure, which I found the orchids in. Over at Ramsay Conservation Park, very sandy soil. You can see the orchid growing there, but you can see that the ants brought up some of the sand from below. The little ant hill down the bottom, you see it just looks like beach sand. You get the Thelmitras. Once again, one's Minlacowie Conservation Park. Thelmitras all through the area. They seem to cope quite well with the soil, the sandy soil, as they do at Aldinga Scrub. There's Minlacowie, more sandy soil. This is south of Minleton on private property. You see the soil here's quite rubbly, got a bit of a reddish tinge that's probably from a bit of laterite, iron staining. Ferry's McDonald Conservation Park, we did a field trip there about a month ago. Once again, very sandy, but that's in that sand dune area. So these are ancient stranded beach lines. Orchids everywhere, and in Ferry's McDonald, once again, I always look closely at the ant nests, because the ants bring up the soil from just below the surface, and you can see the contrast with the surface quartz, and underneath is a bit more clay structure. I love the ant nests, I always have a close look. And of course, the soil's very poor nutrient levels. You get great fields of carnivorous plants, the droseras, because they need to supplement their very poor diet. So yeah, when I was there a few weeks ago, I zoomed in and had a close look at the soil, and it looks 100% silica. That's 100% quartz. That could be a sample I looked at in the Cooper Basin in the Hutton Sandstone. Beautifully rounded, sand-sized grains, most of them rounded, a few subangular. Very little other material in there. It's just about pure beach sand. And so when I was at Black Point only a couple of weeks ago, I took a photograph of the beach sand, and you can see it's very similar. This has got a few more dark particles in it, but very, very similar to a beach sand. So our pyro orchids, nigrans, seems to love the sandy areas, wherever you often see the leaves. This is Pathaway Conservation Park. Once again, zooming on the ants, you can see the beautiful clean sand. Aldinga scrub, very sandy. Newland Head Conservation Park, down the bottom there of the Flurio. Very rocky, calcareous. You get great fields of this Canidia prostrata, the running postman, carpeting the area. But the orchids seem to find little patches that are a bit more clay. I notice they tend to find habitats within this sort of quite inhospitable coastal environment under bushes where there's been a bit more build-up of clay. You can see it there. It's a lot clayey, but these tend to be small pockets, so it pays to take notice of the soil and where the orchids are growing. There's a close-up of the soil structure. Of course, if you're in the Flinders Ranges, it's completely different again. You've got these great, massive, ancient rocks, 700 million years old, eroding. The soils tend to be richer. They're not so much silica, but they've got a lot of clays in them, and clay tends to be quite reactive, and also a lot of essential minerals in clay which promote plant life. So you can see this is Mambray Creek and the orchid coming up here, and this more loamy, this is probably 35% clay amongst the sand. And a lot of the orchids growing amongst the ancient rock. Mambray Creek, I was up there a few years ago. When we did the southeast trip, which we did, was that 2 years ago, on the way back, I stopped at Christmas Rocks. It's just this tiny little, they call it a conservation park, but you'd literally kick a football across from one side to the other. But it's actually a granite sort of outcrop, and this granite is about 480 million years old, and it came up, and it was an island at one stage. There was a whole heap of these granites, which originally were 10 kilometres under the earth, because granite forms under the earth, very coarse crystalline, and the earth has been eroded away and exposed the granite. It was part of the very ancient mountain range we had running through, which was possibly as high as the Himalayas. But by the time it eroded down 480 million years ago and was exposed, this was an ocean, and these would have been sticking out of the ocean. So a lot of the granite is quite smooth. It almost looks like the beautiful smooth granites at Victor Harbour and Port Elliot. But I was glad I stopped in. We missed that trip. We didn't do that stop on our trip. We ran out of time that day, so on the way home, but there were thelmitras everywhere, beautiful but happily growing in amongst this granite, crumbly granite, but all around farmland as far as the eye could see. So this was just one little island where these orchids were. And I also did a trip to the Grampians with the Field Geology Club a few years back, and we went up to Mount Williams. Some quite rare orchids right up at Mount Williams is the high point in the Grampians. As you walk up the top, there were a few orchids, but these have been basically isolated on these ranges. I did meet some local Victorians and they were taking photos. They said, yeah, there's not many orchids. They said, you're lucky if you can find some, and I found a few, but not many. And the Grampians is a case of geological isolation, so the Grampians sticks up higher than all the rest of the surrounding area. It's all been eroded down. And plants have less and less environment to live in because their environment, they have to adapt to the elevation. So there are a lot of rare or endemic plants found in the Grampians, so it's well worth the trip. All right, so what have we learnt tonight? What did I learn? I probably confused you a bit, but I learnt that orchids have been around for 120 million years. They did most of their speciation around 83 million years. They really started to take off. They've been greatly affected by global cooling. Most of the diversification happened in the last 5 million years. The orchid hotspots for diversification are Central and South America. In Australia, orchids really are controlled by precipitation, and they don't like the interior. And the soil type can be quite important, along with pollinators and along with the mycorrhizal, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of research out there, so maybe someone like Leo, when he's out measuring the plants, he can measure the soil as well. All right, so like I said, I'm not an expert on the topic, but I did learn a few things, so I encourage you all to give a talk at some stage and learn something new. All right, thank you.